you should now see the presentation here. So, good day to everybody as well, and welcome to this indeed final public presentation for our 3-year project Mapineq. And we're going to talk about a bit about the education, especially because quite a few parts of the project have been actually dealing with some sort of effects or influences of education or its consequences or also things that are behind of educational attainment. And just a few words about the project in the beginning first. The Mapineq stands for Mapping Inequalities to the Life course. We started 3 years ago, and it's been a Horizon project, Europe project, between 8 European organizations. So University of Turku, my own host institute, University of Groningen, UNED Madrid, Berlin, Stockholm University, Tallinn University, then of course Population Europe that is organizing this event as well, and then University of Oxford Demographic Science Center, Leverhulme Center for Demographic Science. And yeah, indeed, I've been coordinating PI for the project, but of course there have been a bunch of other highly established scholars involved in that. So it has been really an enjoyment to do this research. Overall, we had 3 major research questions for the project. First was that how local and national opportunity structures enhance, suppress, or mediate inequalities. Second, how do changes and spillovers across the life domains and over the life course contribute to these inequalities? And third, how are inequalities influenced by policies and societal shocks? And a bit of a clarification for the concepts as such. So with the opportunity structures, we refer to social institutions, demographic and macroeconomic conditions, and socio-environmental contexts. For instance, education, labor market, family and physical environments. That we analyzed across the countries and regions and localities. Then with spillovers, we refer to in unintended consequences or externalities, where changes in one life domain, such as family, for instance, would lead to the unforeseen changes in other domains, such as the labor market. And then societal transformations, where we are referring to the kind of a contemporary trends in family complexity, fertility changes, migration, digitalization, and also looking at the societal shocks like global financial crisis, especially COVID-19 pandemic, which is still fresh in mind when we started. And overall, the project was structured like this. So we had 5 work packages where we did the kind of substantial research, and they were split between the pre-market, in-market period, and market exit period of the life course, looking also how these processes basically proceed between these stages. And in order to support this research and also research after the project, we also built up this inequality database, Mapineq Link, which is now open and accessible, and what you all can use for your own research goods and purposes as also in the future, and also provide further data to enhance the database if you wish to do so. But I've shared you the links to the database in the end of the presentation. And of course, we had work packages then for the dissemination and management and communication as well as usual. But today we are going to be focusing on especially one part of the project, which is the things that we have or the results that we have related to education. And we have managed to work out with Daniel a catchy title, Europe's Best Bet, Education Europe's Best Bet, or Not Enough. And we're focusing especially in this regard of findings that we have in the project, and also maybe think about bit further what should result from or what should follow from our findings and other findings as well related to the educational system in Europe. But let's start with the kind of a commonly accepted truths about the education that have been kind of directing our decision and decision making related to education and also research on education. It's fairly well established that education is the most important policy tool to reduce family background related social inequalities for different kind of socioeconomic and demographic outcomes. It's also a key component for skill development for the different nations and for the inclusive economic growth. And we kind of assume that there's no upper limit for this, in a sense that you can continue increase the level of education and for society, whatever long and how far you want to go, and there's no kind of there shouldn't be a kind of a massive trade-offs in that. And of course, it has been a kind of education has been kind of one of the success stories of the unified Europe. The latest kind of a success parts come from the early childhood education that has been during the last years has been the systems have been greatly kind of a unifying across the countries. But of course, there are longer term or the earlier successes as well regarding to compulsory education, vocational education that is strongly linked with the industries, and of course, perhaps especially those who, for us who are working in the universities, the affordable mass higher education that has been harmonized across the countries through the Bologna process. So in that regard, this is kind of considered as a kind of a key element of Europe as well today. And I guess you can kind of generalize that for societies, the kind of argument behind this is okay, for societies, investments on human capital through education, they always pay off. And definitely it seems to be that the Europe has followed this principle during the recent decades, and then quite a few other places as well, especially across the OECD countries, but also elsewhere, especially in the developing countries. But there are naturally some caveats as well in these arguments. Based on our research, but also research elsewhere, we could still agree that okay, education is still the best bet for the Europe, but there are limitations. At the same time, there's kind of a ways to increase equality in terms of family background. It is perhaps nowadays the most important pathway, as well as a source of nearly all social inequalities, whether that applies to the family structure or income or labor market or whatever. So actually, it's not only reducing family inequalities, but actually increasing and enhancing other inequalities. It also seems to be that the improving access to higher education, which was always kind of a golden way of increasing equality of opportunity, it is no longer as effective tool for reducing these inequalities as it once was. And in some countries, we have actually seen that it has been starting to work to the opposite direction. So actually, the increases in higher changes, especially in higher education, are actually now seem to be increasing inequalities rather than reducing them. And because of that, we should also think about already a bit more about this alternative multi-domain policy mixes to further reduce differences in educational and socioeconomic achievement by family background. Now, I will now run through some of the results that we have had in the project. So basically going through 4 different kind of themes that we have had. I won't be able to cover everything. We have a massive list of research that we have managed to do, but I'm trying to touch the kind of a most interesting, at least for this point of view, the results that we have had in the project. So I will go through some of the findings on the persistency of the family background benefits, but also persistency of this family background effect barriers that exist. Then going drilling down from the country level to the local level and focusing on some of the findings on the local opportunity structures and barriers, especially related to education. Then I will say something about the findings on family education and its relationship to the economic circumstances of the families, especially child poverty. Then move on to kind of what happens after education, kind of beyond the educational system, what's the kind of a spillover effects from there. And then I try to provide you some of the conclusions overall in the project, not only touching for education, but also extending to the other areas we have studied in the project. So let's start with the persistent benefits and barriers. So it seems to be that the intergenerational benefits of parental higher education, especially, they remain very persistent, even if they have been slowly diminishing. It has to be said that that these differences haven't really disappeared, and in some countries actually reversed. And this is what I already mentioned, that this seems to be that there indeed these still remain, and we probably will see these differences also for the forthcoming decades, independent of what we actually do in policy wise. Naturally, we can also see from our results that the institutions matter, and educational institutions as well. And it seems to be that the selectivity of the system remains a key issue. This is, of course, an old result and what we have known already, but our results kind of confirm that. In less selective systems, such as the UK, Belgium, and Finland, the access is broader, and gaps in the attainment between social groups are smaller. And in contrast, we have some more selective systems, such as in Austria, Italy, and Hungary, that continue to reproduce strong inequalities, and in some cases also actually enhancing these inequalities. So in a sense that we can say, okay, that it's clearly kind of a repeating finding that we still find these differences independently of the country context, even in the most egalitarian versions of the countries that we can think of, where these differences are smallest, but they are still persistent and matter greatly for the educational outcomes and also other socioeconomic and demographic outcomes. There are also what we call as persistent barriers, especially due to the loss of family human capital. And most established finding is perhaps is that there's a negative association between parental separation and education that is consistent and can be found, I guess, in almost all societies. There is, of course, bigger doubts whether this is a causal association or a matter of selection, but definitely this association persists. And that's also, according to our findings, it seems to be that the changes in this association have been fairly small across the multiple decades in Europe, despite actually that definitely the normative acceptability of separation has been growing during this decade. So despite of this kind of normative dimension, the kind of overall negative association remains more or less stable. It seems to be that these are also these negative effects of, they are not entirely and always equal, and of course they differ slightly from a country to another. But overall, it seems to be that the losing family human capital through either parental separation or parental death is mostly detrimental across the social strata. So everybody kind of loses something in terms of a kids' educational outcomes, definitely. After the parental separation. And if you just focus on the higher educated, where you can, in some research suggests that there the losses might still be the strongest. There actually the detrimental effects are due to the reduced ability of parents to compensate for the weaker innate abilities of the children. So parental separation actually kind of it reduces the kind of the advantage that these high educated families have in terms of ability to compensate the missing abilities of their kids. In a sense, have a weird equalizing effect in a sense as well for educational attainment. Of course, you might then think that, okay, let's then the one way of tackling this thing is just to provide, for instance, adult education to families to improve human capital, or of course that might be these improvements may happen through the repartnering of the parents. So there might be one better educated parent actually entering the family, but these effects are fairly weak if exist at all, and that's definitely the effects to repartnering. They are the results for that are really mixed, and even in the Finnish case, entirely opposite, depending on the research of the study and the kind of a setup for how this is studied. Okay, but anyway, there seems to be this kind of this persistent barriers as well as the persistent benefits of the higher education family background. So let's look at then the importance of the local opportunity structures and opportunity barriers as well. So quite often we assume that, okay, we should increase then the access to higher education, especially, although it might matter for the other educational institutes, but especially higher education. And this argument seems to be confirmed by our results. Across the Europe, it seems to be that increasing the local availability of higher education is beneficial and can reduce family background inequalities quite substantially. So this study conducted in European Social Survey suggests that up to from 70 to 30% of the educational inequalities are regional if we contrast that with between country differences. And actually, the reductions that we have seen in the importance of family background in education, they are actually explained by the reduced within country inequalities in that regard. So things that happen, how countries are kind of homogenizing the educational system and access to education, that is a kind of a key component that has reduced the importance of family background across them. But of course, there are of course limitations to that. It seems to be that it definitely makes sense to kind of to build these opportunity structures, basically start a new higher education institutions where the potential students are, but not necessarily that it would benefit for those families actually moving for their education. Our Finnish Finnish findings suggest that the moving to an area with the better higher education opportunities, they cannot overcome with the negative effects of residential mobility. And it seems to be that these mobility effects are almost always detrimental for the children on the long run, even if they would potentially be beneficial for the parents. So even if parents would move for the better job, for instance, the kids never actually benefit from that. On the rather opposite, we see the detrimental effects for the children. And also quite interestingly, if we look at our city attractiveness conjoint study and that's results, it seems to be that even if the people appreciate higher educational institutions around their environment, that having such an institute in your city doesn't really make it more attractive. So that's a rare reason for people to actually move from one city to another, basically. A bit more about the local opportunity structures. We have also some findings about the early childhood education. We know from the previous literature that the benefits of early childhood education, final education, they are quite mixed. So we have some country results where there are clearly benefits, especially for the children who are growing up in disadvantaged families, and especially the earliest results from the 60s kind of suggested that this would be where the most beneficial effects would be found. And we can still find that for some groups, for instance, some migrant children for sure, in lots of other different country contexts. But there are definitely multiple country exceptions that doesn't really fit this rule, and quite often we don't see any benefits for the extending early childhood education for the final educational outcomes. And one of the studies that we conducted within this project was that we looked at the regional expansion of early daycare in Finland in the 70s. And then looked what kind of a relationship that had in the final educational outcome 40 years later. And we didn't find the direct benefit for the childcare expansion, basically replicating previous findings in Finland. However, we did see that there were universal improvements in the what we call the chance to meet the genetic potential for educational attainment, meaning that there was a stronger association with the polygenesis score for education and final education when there were more early day care places available in the municipality. Further, and of course, that even if the education, early childhood education doesn't seem to be linked to the children's own education directly, we definitely have repeated findings also in the project that that having early childhood education opportunities that benefits families through improving women's labor market attachment. So that increases the family income, and that family income is then beneficial for the kids as well in various ways. So in that sense, we kind of are confirming the results that have been what the results have been elsewhere, also suggesting earlier. Right. Well, next. Yeah, the local opportunity barriers. Of course, there are also local barriers to what actually can be achievable and what happens rather regionally or locally even. So one of the studies we look at the COVID-19 pandemic and what kind of effects that had based on the school length of the school closure in different regions, basically. And the findings suggest that this urban-rural gap in math and reading skills in PISA data that seemed to be widened by the COVID-19 pandemic. But to a bit of a surprise, there was no association with this widening because of the length of the school closure or even the technological preparedness of the area to do remote teaching and learning. So this suggests that there actually are much more complex, maybe peer-related mechanisms that matter and are actually explaining these learning deficits or widening gap in the learning of skills, basically. And that definitely seems to be that more research is needed in this regard. Why there was such a widening of skill levels. Further, we have also other kind of local barriers and things that we kind of tend to think that we have moved forward already in also in the developing countries, like in many places in Europe. There was a study focusing on the introduction of the low emission zone in Madrid in 2018, and the study shows that improved the air quality. And also using this difference in difference approach, they also show that led to significant increase in exam scores among the kids who lived on those areas. So, and that was actually surprisingly wide and extensive effect as well in the learning results. And of course, that kind of seems surprising. We kind of, I guess, quite a few of us have kind of already thought that we have in Europe moved beyond these kind of concerns, but definitely these results show that this is something that we still should pay attention to different places even in the already developed context as well. And also there are kind of emerging environmental concerns as well, especially related to the increase in global warmth in general. And in another study, this was exactly studied by looking at the long-term heat exposure and the regional difference in the long-term heat exposure and academic performance using data from Spain. And indeed, these results show that if there is a long-term exposure that has a negative association with the academic performance, and that a negative association is particularly pronounced among the students from the less educated families. And this kind of suggests the kind of what we already know, that there are unequal vulnerabilities to the environmental stressors, and of course those who are in the disadvantaged family environment, they are suffering most of these kind of things. And even if we could say that, okay, maybe the pollution issues we are kind of managing to tackle and making them less urgently addressable issues, definitely then these warmth issues and long-term heat exposure issues are something that we probably are seeing that are going to be more prevalent in the future rather than disappearing. So it's most likely seems that these local opportunity barriers will remain a kind of a crucial issue for the for inequalities in education and how education leads to the further inequalities in societies. Then some findings about the family education and economic circumstances, what we look at as well. One of the studies we checked out how the child poverty, how much that is associated between the family education and contrasting that with the family structural factors, namely whether families are intact or separated and whether how many siblings they are actually sharing the family resources. And the results clearly show that actually all of the countries that we studied, the childhood poverty is much more likely resulting from the parental educational differences that lead to differences in labor market returns rather than the differences between the family structures. So if you intend to reduce family childhood poverty, you probably would try to improve educational attainment of the parents and their labor market attachment rather than try to, for instance, regulate possibilities for separations and divorces or think about what you can do to the number of children, basically. Also, we also find studying Finland and Sweden that this childhood economic differences, especially mother's income, still make a causal difference for children's educational attainment, even in the highly egalitarian countries. In both Finland and Finland and Sweden, education and especially higher education, but education at all levels, is there's no educational fees, but still the family incomes matter also beyond just the educational level of the parents. And this is something that we kind of think that, okay, these issues have been already dealt with in this context, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It has to be added, though, that the stable employment was nearly equally important as the income. So it kind of underlines the potential of both income distribution and employment policies in reducing the family background inequalities in educational attainment. So you can definitely use these tools as well to reduce educational differences, family background differences for sure. Okay, let's then move slightly beyond the education then. So one of the surprises that we have, of course, we have quite often discussed in in research that okay that the health issues are the major concern and source of inequality in the aging part of the population. But one of the surprising findings that we had was that poor health is quite a contributor to the young adults inequalities as well. We found that the young adults need probability was increased by 30% by the poor health alone in Europe, and that was way beyond what any of us kind of imagined. And also there were further findings as well about okay when this health was also found to be standout determinants of the happiness of the population. It clearly kind of seems that we have to consider the health inequalities as well from very early ages onwards and see how those things also accumulate and add the further inequalities across the life course. And not only consider that they are issues for the aging population alone. And indeed, basically the same result what we already mentioned that okay, this early childhood education, even if that doesn't necessarily contribute to the children's education, it matters especially for highly educated women's labor market attachment, as well as the highly educated women's family formation and childbearing, and especially in the high unemployed and high regions and high unemployed periods. So basically, there are benefits for the early childhood education, but they actually work through the parents rather than through the kids directly, which is an important aspect to remember. And also, if you think about the later life, it's also clear that where you live what's your education, what's your health, and your gender, they all play a decisive role in shaping these later, especially later career outcomes, as well as old age exit from the labor market. We know that, and this is something that quite a few of these pension systems in Europe cannot really cope with this kind of differences. But definitely, these are important aspects to consider jointly rather than separately, and looking at the fairly fine-grained local level variation in these aspects in order to figure out what's actually the fair level of pension contribution, pension pays, basically. Okay, what to conclude from all of this in the end? So we can see that in first of all that the inequalities in Europe, they are still varying according to differences between national institutions. So national differences are still major source of all kind of inequalities, whether that's in educational system, labor markets, or social policies. And also when we are looking at the fine-grained regional differences, there doesn't seem to be kind of a uniform pattern how these regional social inequalities actually unfold. Sometimes they are weaker than national inequalities, sometimes they are stronger, but definitely in almost all cases they definitely still contribute. Even if the strengths of these effects are different, the mechanisms of inequality appear to be fairly similar across the regions, but also the kind of then that means that the manifestations are different basically across them. And this is also naturally understandable because there are different socioeconomic structures for the different regions in terms of education, age, and family structure, for instance. And of course, they are differently exposed to the externalities. For instance, unemployment may hit very differently to the different areas depending what kind of a labor market structures these areas have. Then there are a bunch of spillover effects that we mentioned that there were, and basically especially conclusion to draw from these spillover effects. So these spillover effects, especially from education to family formation and even fertility and definitely a labor market entry, they kind of illustrate that why these multi-domain policies are essential. So we definitely should consider multiple ways of improving, for instance, education attainment. And of course, the vice versa is true. Also, in social policy discussions, education is often ignored as a policy tool, and at the same time, it cannot really offset the early disadvantage alone, even in the egalitarian societies like Finland and Sweden. So this kind of suggests that there should be a combination of education and labor market policy that would probably yield better results for even for child education outcome, not only in the economic inequalities as such. Also, we can also see that the childhood family structure matches much less than parental education for both the economic conditions of the family and the future educational attainment. But then again, the childhood family surprisingly has actually extensive effects on the labor market participation, which is kind of a counterbalances that we shouldn't ignore this dimension either. Indeed, one of the surprising spillover effects was this, that the poor health is a big risk factor for the education labor market disadvantages everywhere during the early and midlife, and not only focusing on the late life course outcomes, basically. These environmental risks matter, also kind of a mundane environment risks that we thought were kind of things of the past. Seems to be that the traffic pollution can indeed have a rather dramatic impact on the cognitive development of the children, even in the fairly fairly advanced societies like Spain, for instance. And this probably extends to the other contexts as well. And finally, also about this, that of course there are lots of enthusiasm about the kind of this revolution of using genes to study intergenerational attainment. And of course, there's a very vocal opposition still, that they're saying that we should, if we are concentrating the socioeconomic inequalities, intergenerational socioeconomic inequalities, we should not touch this. But kind of these results that we have in the project as well underline that the debate is not that much whether we should focus on nature or nurture, but rather that these two things are working jointly. Genes matter for the socioeconomic outcomes jointly with the social and demographic environment-related factors, and this joint effect shouldn't be ignored. Then there were a couple of things about the policies and shocks that we want to conclude. The events like pandemic or financial crisis and how they matter for different kind of educational and socioeconomic as well as demographic outcomes. They reveal the kind of the structural vulnerabilities that in the normal conditions we would probably much more hidden. And we see that in the disrupted education and labor markets unevenly. And it kind of is kind of what we already knew, but kind of what our findings also underline that these shocks tend to magnify the pre-existing inequalities and also their regional variation. So definitely these shocks matter, and they matter locally. The variation locally matters much more than at the national level. And it can be kind of a conclude that this policy resilience, it comes of critical in safeguarding equity, but during the crisis, maybe this policy should be more targeted than otherwise is done. And then finally to the data. So we had a massive effort of putting together the Mapineq link regional database. You can all access to that today, and also use the API to combine that with your own data sets. And that's going to be maintained by the University of Oxford for at least a couple of years forward. And that has been a massive effort, and that will remain as a data asset for cross-national regional analysis for many years to come. And also we are welcoming any input that you might have from your own research for extending that database. It's supposed to be a global database, not only restricted to the Europe, even if at the moment the most of the data comes from the European context. But definitely we have also found that kind of a bump into the remaining European data issues. So when we started, we thought, okay, that actually that European regional data should be pretty okay already nowadays. But this definitely is not the case. This regional granularity of European data is still often insufficient, both for the use of research and policy use. And that was a bit of a surprise. Whether we thought that there should be a better situation, but that was not the case. Even if the national statistical offices would actually have quite a granular data, it's not provided to kind of common use at the European level. So there are substantial regional differences, and what we kind of also see that we would prefer to see a bit more details about these regions. So, for instance, just the simple urban-rural distinction that makes that's more informative than the information on what region we are talking about alone. And this better data is indeed that is needed if we want to do targeted interventions and monitoring that we probably wish to do if we want to improve our policies in any inequality-related regard. And then finally to the policy recommendations. So for further reducing family background influences, we have seen that that maybe the just increasing access to education, especially higher education, that is not enough and not sufficient to reduce the family background influences. So for that purpose, we need more nuanced approaches. And what we suggest that we should implement this universal multi-domain policies hand in hand with more targeted interventions in general. And this intervention should be designed regionally, depending on the educational, demographic, and economic profiles of those areas. that we think that these mechanisms are the same, but the population distributions are so different that that really should pay off quickly. And in general, if people are concerned with the equal opportunities of the children, we actually should in policies adopt the child-focused approach as contrast to the family or parents as a unit approach. So, and this is a kind of a reflect how we, for instance, are calculating the equalizing family incomes, for instance. That's very family-based rather than child-based approach in most of the times that it's used. And we really think that the more fair approach from the kids' point of view would be actually looking at the children and how they are, what kind of conditions they are facing, rather than the families in general. Um, in general, I think what we want to also remind that, okay, just to underline the importance of these spillovers. When policies are implemented, also when they are studied, we kind of concentrate on one type of effects at the same time. But at the same time, we also know as a social scientist that there are a bunch of other things happening at the same time. And this, I think, is really important to remember that these policies are rarely implemented in a vacuum. We should pay attention to what these spillovers do. And yeah, policy effectiveness depends on the informed dynamic responses that can be actually verified with reliable data. And I'm not sure whether we actually have this reliable data at the moment yet, even in the European context. So to end with this, okay, that we end with the plea that we need a harmonized longitudinal multi-domain and register-based data set across the Europe, what we call as a next-gen use silicon steroids, register-based survey, and secondary data enhanced European-wide data sets. Thank you, everybody, and I'm happy to talk to you and discuss with you of any of the findings that the comments you might have. Here are the links to the database or the project website, the database, then the white paper that this presentation was mostly based on, and all our I think we have 30 or 40 different kind of reports that you can download from the Synod or from the project website. So please have a look at what we have done this far. Thanks.